Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Roundtable Russia's War on Ukraine in the Context of Genocide. My name is Marta Bazouk, and I'm the Executive Director of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. We are a project at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, established in 2014 with generous funding from the Timurte Foundation. I'd like to say just a few words about the work of our organization before we begin today's roundtable. Our mandate is to promote research and education about the Holodomor, the genocidal famine in Soviet Ukraine in 1932-1933, during which millions of people in Ukraine were starved to death. I'd like to bring to your attention two of our most recent publications that are particularly relevant to today's discussion. This past year, McGill Queen's Press published the volume Genocide, the Power and Problems of a Concept. We're just showing you the cover here. It's edited by Frank Sisson and Andrea Graziosi. This volume came out of a conference that HREC had organized, and it addressed issues around the concept of genocide. I should mention that the volume includes an article by one of our panelists today, Douglas Irvin Erickson. I'd like also point to another collection of articles that arose from a different HREC conference, and discussions. I've been noticing an increase in discussions around the whole question of empire and colonialism as it relates to Russia and the Soviet Union. So this collection, Empire, Colonialism, and Famine, these articles were published online in East-West Journal of Ukrainian Studies, and you can access these either through the journal website or through the website of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. And Tom has kindly displayed a page from our website. I'd only like to add that our website has a range of resources about the Holodomor. You can find articles, videos from past conferences. There's a photo directory featuring authenticated photos from the whole time of the Holodomor. And there are very few of those because unlike today, it was virtually impossible at that time to document the crimes taking place. There are educational materials on the website, survivor testimonies. The website's also a place to go to learn of opportunities for HREC grants and fellowships. And that's all I'll say for now. I do invite you to explore the website. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dirk Moses. Dirk Moses is Frank Porter Graham Distinguished Professor of Global Human Rights History at the University of North Carolina. He published his first book, German Intellectuals and the Nazi Past, in 2007. He has edited 3 anthologies on genocide and colonialism: Genocide in Settler Society, Frontier Violence and Stolen Indigenous Children, Colonialism and Genocide, and Empire, Colony, Genocide, Conquest, Occupation, and Subaltern Resistance in World History. Professor Moses today will discuss the Russian invasion in the context of genocide theory and law, and the limitations and challenges, both in definition and application. I'd like to add he is senior editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. Professor Moses, you may begin.
Thanks very much, Marta, for the generous introduction and for the invitation to participate in this forum on this deeply troubling topic. I mean, those of us who work on genocide often work in an historical mode about episodes in the past. I mean, when it's an issue, whether you want to call it genocide or not, that's unfolding before your eyes. It's all the more disturbing. Which leads me to the issue of scholarly ethics. What is our role as scholars in a scholarly forum? And we are in the public domain here, but it's hosted by a university institute. And I'm uncertain about this myself. Do we fall behind and stand with the Ukrainian struggle in all its dimensions as advocates, or do we engage in some critical distance? So while I'm making up my mind on this, as editor of the Journal of Genocide Research, I've commissioned a series of articles on the conflict, or the invasion rather, so that we get those long hot takes on Twitter and even in the newspapers into a longer form, more scholarly form for posterity, where there's footnotes and things can be cited for the future, because these Twitter hot takes are ephemeral and disappear. And of course, we've engaged Ukrainian scholars and other scholars from the region, from Estonia, from Poland and elsewhere, and Russia, who are writing on different aspects of it. So I thought, as a journal editor and as a scholar, I can contribute something in this way. And I hope that's useful. Now, I have to also say that I'm not with some realists and others on the left who plead for understanding for Russia's security concerns, as they seem to imply that post-Soviet states don't have their own security concerns, for example, Ukraine. I sometimes smell a whiff of Marx and Engels' notion of historical and non-historical nations in arguments on the left, some arguments. The historical nations destined to drive along history, and the non-historical ones, which were considered by Marx and Engels to be small and reactionary states, or peoples rather, destined to be absorbed by powerful neighbors. Now, I reject this approach, nor do I think progressive politics is necessarily always pacifist. Occupied and invaded peoples have a right to resist, at least a moral one, if not a legal one. And I wish Australians and Americans, or at least more of us, understood this in other contexts. And I often see an alarming lack of consistency on this point by many liberals. Now, leaving that aside, my solidarity is with the Ukrainian civilians and people. And my instincts are to even support arming its military, because that's what they're asking for. Helping smaller nations invaded by their paranoid neighbors is something we should support, I say. Now, does that mean, though, buying into increasing rhetoric about defeating Russia and permanently weakening it, as we're hearing? If so, what kind of strategic endgame is envisaged here? For Russia is not Germany in 1939 or 1941, as some people seem to think. Russia is both less and more powerful. It's a declining empire without Germany's massive industrial base in the 30s, but it is armed with nuclear weapons, which Germany never was, thankfully. So this is where historical analogies don't help very much. Do we think Russia's current leadership is going to tolerate defeat? If not, do we really want World War III? This, and not just the issue of historical justice and prosecutions of criminality, is also the context for talk about genocide. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, understands that when he rejected Biden's mention of genocide. For one can't negotiate with modern Hitlers. One has to defeat them utterly. So what is our role as scholars in this context? Well, in the end, it's to tell the truth. And this is the truth in my view. This is how I see it. Colonial analogies do in fact work, and Marta alluded to some of those in a recent publication of our institute. Timothy Snyder in the New Yorker yesterday argued that Russia is waging a colonial war on Ukraine. He's not the first, of course, but he put it in a longer essay, and I quote him where he says, "What is to be resisted is elemental, the threat of national extinction represented by Russian colonialism, a war of destruction expressly designed to resolve the Ukrainian question." I agree 100%. Now, part of this broader truth is a history of this kind of warfare. Here's a comment by an Algerian commentator in 1956 about the French suppression of an Algerian independence movement. And I quote the article from the journal Africa Today, 1956. "Entire villages are shelled, bombed, and burnt. Acts of genocide are committed against the inhabitants of towns and villages. An indiscriminate campaign of extermination is now taking place. These are acts of genocide committed against people whose only crime is their love for liberty and their desire to preserve their own culture." Now, for over 20 years, I've tried to effect a colonial turn in genocide studies to make precisely this point. Timothy Snyder and I have spoken about it, and on this point, we do agree. Now, Marta mentioned three of these books that I've edited a long time ago on trying to theorize genocide and colonialism, which was not a popular topic when I started working on genocide in the late 90s. And the basic instinct is that colonial warfare is by its nature genocidal. Now, the person who invented the concept of genocide theorized genocide in these terms, and I quote him, Raphael Lemkin. This is in 1944, when he's talking about the Nazi and Axis occupation of Europe. "Genocide has two phases," he said. "One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition in turn may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone after removal of the population and the colonization of the area by the oppressor's own nationals, end of quote. He then adumbrated 7 techniques of what he called occupation, we'd call them policies today, which together comprised a genocidal occupation. One policy was political, which meant the destruction of the self-government and local rule of the occupied people and the replacement of rule by the occupier. The second technique or policy was social, which meant attacking the colonized people's intelligentsia. The third was cultural, which banned on the native languages and so forth. Of course, that's what Putin is talking about when he mentions the ban on Russian in Eastern Ukraine. The fourth is economic techniques of genocide, shifting economic resources from the occupied to the occupier. The fifth is biological, which is decreasing birth rates of the occupied. The sixth is physical techniques of genocide, which Lemkin meant as rationing food, endangering the health, and mass killing of the occupied people. Then there were religious and moral techniques of genocide. He talks about weakening the spiritual resistance of a national group and the moral debasement through declining elevated concepts of national thinking, so people just reduced to basic physical instincts. Now, for many at the time, in the 1940s, as for Lemkin, nationality was constituted by spiritual and, is the term they used, and physical dimensions. So regarding the latter, Lemkin talked about the biological essence of a nation, or even a biological national power. I mean, these aren't concepts I think we'd be comfortable using today, but he thought they were elemental to nationality because, quote, a nation cannot rise again to resist an aggressor if it's been physically destroyed. Repeatedly, Lemkin expressed the demographic calculations of the Nazis. He said they aimed at winning the peace even though the war itself was lost, by destroying, disintegrating, and weakening an enemy nation. And in this way, he said, the occupier was, quote, in a position to deal with other people from the viewpoint of biological superiority. Now, on the other side, on the spiritual side, he talked about nations having souls that could be destroyed by assimilation, like banning the use of languages. After the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland in the late 30s, their governments in exile issued reports on the German occupation detailing the policies they said were destroying their nations, ranging from changes in citizenship on the one hand to mass murder on the other. Such policies were part of, quote, one long chain of physical and moral violence directed towards the destruction of the Polish nation, as one Polish report put it in 1940. So nationality as a whole, the Polish nation as a whole, was under attack, and not just its citizens. Now, Lemkin adopted this logic, arguing that the Hague Convention of 1907, the international treaty governing occupation of conquered territory and peoples, should criminalize what he quoted. He said, every action infringing upon the life, liberty, health, corporal existence, or integrity, economic existence, and the honor of the inhabitants when committed because they belong to a national, racial, or religious group. And in the second, these are his words, every policy aiming at the destruction or aggrandizement of one such group to the prejudice or detriment of another. And he sometimes wrote that genocide meant crippling of nations. Now, this definition of genocide reflects the lived experience of mixed populations of Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews. Now we're talking about Ukrainian territory, living serially under Russian, Polish, German, and Soviet rule on the territory of modern Ukraine during the 20th century, enduring multiple phases of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Consciousness of nationality and its fragility was and remains intensely experienced. And Russia's campaign against Ukraine is precisely what Lemkin was trying to capture with his new word. But states did not follow Lemkin's broad definition in the UN Genocide Convention. Why? A month after the Charter for the Nuremberg trials in September 1945 was issued, American Justice Robert Jackson explained the trial's rationale in a New York Times Magazine article entitled "The Worst Crime of All," which justified why aggressive warfare was the supreme, or crimes against peace, was the supreme crime, because all other wartime crimes derived from the act of invasion. Now, Fran Hirsch could tell us, she's the expert here, that he took this idea from Arnold Treinen, from a Russian thinker, and Fran's has written a very important book about this. Now, from the terrible ravages of the war that he witnessed as he toured defeated Germany and learned of its crimes, Jackson drew a further conclusion, and I quote him: "If there is to be future wars, if there are to be future wars, we have got to win them by being better killers, by killing more and killing more quickly than the enemy, by killing with less risk to ourselves." In making this declaration, he proceeded, remarkably for a lawyer, to advocate violating the principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants by casting warfare as a conflict between entire peoples and not solely military forces. Reasoning like the strategic bombing plan of the 1920s and 30s, he was subtly justifying civilian destruction, although he did not mention the Allies' bombing of German and Japanese cities that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. He was thinking of a future possible war with the Soviet Union. He wrote in this article, "For the obvious fact, well, the fact is obvious, that modern war has become more and more a struggle between whole populations, not between armies alone. The issue is which shall be subjugated and which will survive," unquote. And this is the New York Times Magazine. Now, here with Jackson, the avatar of Nuremberg justice and held up as a paragon of virtue, averred a military policy of permanent security with destructive implications for civilians. Killing enemy civilians until they surrendered was the strategy. Now, the UN definition of genocide is much narrower than Lemkin's, precisely so all states can wage colonial-style warfare, which means attacking entire societies to win. Let's not forget that just a few years after Nuremberg, the US relentlessly bombed North Korean cities and transport infrastructure during its war on the Korean Peninsula between 1950 and 1953, killing over 20% of the population, millions, leading one authority, Bruce Cummings, who teaches at University of Chicago, to characterize the campaign as genocidal, although it's something that we really never talk about. Then in the next decade, the US dropped 8 times more bomb tonnage in Indochina in the Vietnam War than during World War II, killing 2 to 3 million people, mainly civilians. And consider now, right now, what's going on in Yemen in a war led by US ally Saudi Arabia. Now, instead, the acts that Lemkin associated with genocide were distributed to other international crimes like war crimes and crimes against humanity. The latter, crimes against humanity, do neatly cover Russian conduct, murder, possibly extermination, forced transfer and deportation, and other inhumane acts. The discriminatory intent based on nationality is captured in the separate crime of persecution, which, like genocide, requires a specific intent. The crime of persecution is where we find, in fact, Lemkin's broader definition of genocide. And the International Commission of Inquiry on Darfur in 2005 categorized Sudanese crimes in this way instead of using the genocide concept. So there's a precedent there. From the perspective of the UN and the International Criminal Court, these are no lesser crimes than genocide. And that's why we hear, and yet we hear some people saying that the Russian campaign has not yet risen to the level of genocide, which is a kind of rhetoric that disturbs me. Why is genocide considered to be the crime of crimes and not crimes against humanity? Now, President Biden acknowledged that lawyers will ultimately determine this issue, although it's unlikely that US lawyers will get near a case if the ICC is involved, because like Russia, the US is not a party to its statute and has in fact impeded its work. Whatever calculations behind Biden's genocide accusation, his government's announcement to provide heavy weapons to Ukraine neatly coincided with the genocide accusation on the same day, I recall. Russia's outrageous assault on the Ukrainian nation and its people is plain to see. Because the convention signatories define genocide so narrowly, Russia's mode of warfare, it's unlikely, unfortunately, to be deemed genocide in a court of law. Unfortunately, precisely because genocide is so narrow, that's the problem as a legal concept. Other military assaults on civilian populations today, as in Yemen, indicate a broader problem, as I've mentioned. The truth that dare not speak its name, and that I think we should be talking about, is that powerful states prevent encroachment on their sovereign rights to pursue their permanent security as they see fit, while complaining about the human rights violations of their rivals. Now, it's because international lawyers like Philippe Sands and others understand the virtual impossibility, which is by design, to prove genocide in a court of law, even if you could capture someone like Putin and his generals, that they have suggested an independent international tribunal, so one that's not run by states, but by senior jurists in London, to try them for the crime of aggression, for launching the war, and not just how it's waged. So jus ad bello, as the lawyers like to put it, because that will be much easier to prove. And, as Jackson put it quite rightly, it is the supreme crime, or it was a supreme crime in the 1940s. But something's happened since then where genocide has been considered the crime of crimes. Now, I don't want to exceed my time. I'm looking at it now. I've got a few other things to say, but might reserve those for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dirk Moses. Our next speaker is Francine Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch is Willis Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches courses on Russian and Soviet history, post-war Europe, and the history of human rights. Her first book, Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge and the Making of the Soviet Union, received several awards, including the Wayne S. Bucinich Prize of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Her second book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal After World War, won 4 prizes, including from the American Society for International Law and the American Historical Association. Dr. Hirsch's current book project is on the long history of Russian-American entanglement, tentatively titled Enemies, a Love Story. Professor Hirsch will be discussing de-Ukrainianization as genocide. She'll look at how the term genocide was introduced and used at the Nuremberg trials and how that can help us make an argument about what is happening today. Professor Hirsch, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you for organizing this event today and inviting me to be a part of it. And Dirk has already given us, I think, lots of interesting things to talk about for our conversation, including these questions about the crime of crimes and crimes against peace and crimes against humanity and how those things played out. But I'll save that for later. To start, I just want to say, and this gets to the question maybe of scholarship and advocacy and how it all goes together. But I've been writing a great deal since the war started, right, in a way that I really never have before for the public, because I do believe that personally that it's the role of scholars to get information out there and to do that job of educating the public. And to me, that's a kind of advocacy. I also want to start by saying that I believe that Russia is committing genocide and that President Biden and Canada's House of Commons are correct in recognizing this. And also that I comment this as a historian of World War II and the Nuremberg trials and not as a lawyer. And I think it's important to get out there as well. And right now, I'm less interested in prosecuting cases than in stopping a genocide that's currently taking place in Ukraine. I think that there is already significant evidence out there that Russia has set out to destroy in whole or in part the Ukrainian nation through the murder of Ukrainians, by causing serious bodily and mental harm to Ukrainians, and by deliberately creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the Ukrainian nation itself. We've been seeing the targeted bombing of civilians, rapes, the kidnapping of children, deportations, the targeted murder of local Ukrainian leaders and activists, and the intentional destruction of the Ukrainian culture. We've heard reports of soldiers who, after committing rape, have told their victims that they, quote, want to prevent them from having Ukrainian children. Now, usually intent is something that's more difficult to prove in cases of genocide, but in this case, I don't think it's quite as difficult. But again, I'm not coming at this as a lawyer, and that's a conversation we can have later. But Russian leaders have boldly announced their intent to wipe out the Ukrainian nation, to erase the Ukrainian identity, this Ukrainian identity, which they've been describing for some time now as artificial and as anti-Russian. Putin and other Russian officials have demonized the Ukrainian people as Nazis. The Russian military has been told that it's carrying out a campaign of denazification. And the Russian media, which is completely state-controlled and thus must be understood as an arm of the state, has equated denazification with de-Ukrainization. And there's been a lot of talk by people about this RIA Novosti article that came out with a plan for genocide. And it's been talked about for good reason. It calls for things like the elimination of Ukraine's political elite. It proclaims that ordinary Ukrainians, and I'm quoting here, must experience all the horrors of war and absorb the experience as a historical lesson and atonement for their guilt as supposed Nazis. And it goes on and much, much more. Now, this is not the first time that such vile ideas have been expressed by people in Putin's circle. There were many such articles actually back in 2016 and 2017. But this article was published in the midst of Russia's brutal war of aggression. While atrocities were being uncovered in Bucha and Mariupol and other cities, while we were learning about deportations and kidnappings and filtration camps and rapes, and this article was not an anomaly, and Russian leaders did not back away from it, right? And say, no, this is not our plan, this is not our intention. The day after this article came out, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who is now one of Putin's advisors, he declared, and I'll quote him, that Ukrainian identity is one big fake. And the goal of the denazification is to change how Ukrainians perceive their identity. Later in the week, Russian state television channel 1, and again, a reminder that we all know that anything that is on Russian TV now, there's extreme censorship, right? This is what the Russian state wants to be on television. It featured a quote unquote discussion about the elimination of Ukraine. And discussions on this topic, again in quotes, have been a regular feature of this programming. I don't know if anyone else has been watching some TV one, but it's incredibly disturbing. Again and again, these calls for the elimination of the Ukrainian nation, calls for the elimination of Ukrainian identity, talk about Ukrainians as Nazis and denazification. These are incitements to genocide. This has to be understood as an incitement to genocide. Calls for the elimination of Ukraine, calls for the elimination of Ukrainian identity, calls for de-Ukrainization. These are calls for genocide. Now, when people say that genocide isn't happening or isn't happening yet or hasn't reached the bar, as Dirk mentioned, right? I mean, I think it's because they have the most extreme model in mind, right? They have the model in mind of the Holocaust. And genocide, the term that was, of course, coined by Raphael Lemkin, it was listed as a war crime in the indictment at the Nuremberg trials. And this is something that I've studied closely, again, of how all these various crimes were defined at Nuremberg. And in the indictment, it was described, and I'll quote here, and I say described because it wasn't a full definition that was offered in the indictment. It was more sort of viz, like this kind of sort out and kind of. And it was sort of described as the extermination of racial and national groups among civilian populations in occupied territories in order to destroy particular races and classes of people and national, racial, or religious groups. Now, initially, the term was used at Nuremberg to talk about the extermination of the Jews and the Gypsies. But as the case continued over the course of the trials, its usage was broadened and actually brought more into line with what Raphael Lemkin initially had intended. It was broadened as a result of Lemkin's efforts, but also due to the efforts of the Czech, Polish, and Yugoslav envoys to the tribunal, Bohuslav Etcher, Stanislav Piotrowski, and Albert Weiss, right? So they were the ones who kept insisting that this term should be broadened because what they were also seeing, they argued, was genocide in other places of other peoples in Eastern Europe. And it was also broadened over the course of the trial thanks to the efforts of the British prosecution. And I'll talk a little bit about that now. British Deputy Chief Prosecutor, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, used the term when presenting evidence against Constantine von North, a former Reich Minister Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He introduced as evidence a memorandum that North had sent to Hitler in August 1940, outlining the policies that he had introduced to suppress the Czech population. These policies outlined in this memo included things like the expulsion of all Czechs from Bohemia and Moravia who were not suitable for Germanization, and that's a quote, including the entire educated class. It included, and I'm quoting here, the extermination of the Czech historical myth. It included a campaign against the use of the Czech language, and it included the erasure of Czech culture. Maxwell Fyfe argued to the tribunal that North had sought to, and I'm quoting again, destroy the Czech people as a national entity with their own language, history, and traditions. And he explained in his presentation that this was genocide. Later in the trial, during the British closing address, British Chief Prosecutor Sir Hartley Shawcross picked up where Maxwell Fyfe left off. He too used the term genocide, and he reminded the court as well that it was not just about extermination or murder. Shawcross revisited the evidence about the Einsatzgruppen. He revisited the evidence about Auschwitz, but he also reminded the tribunal that the Nazis had pursued genocide, and I'm quoting now, in different forms in Poland, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Alsace-Lorraine, and that these forms had included outright annihilation, but also deportation, death by starvation, and forced Germanization. Okay, which brings us back to the present, right? I was asked by a reporter yesterday what the threshold is for calling something a genocide, We are well past the threshold for calling this a genocide. Russian leaders have been inciting genocide while the Russian military carries out mass atrocities. And incitement, by the way, incitement to genocide is also a crime, right, in the Genocide Convention and in the Rome Statute. Given this incitement and the kinds of war crimes and crimes against humanity that we are learning about, I believe that we are obligated to talk about what is happening in Ukraine as a genocide. Now, international lawyers have warned that the International Court of Justice in The Hague has said, and I'm quoting Philippe Sands here from his article, his op-ed in yesterday's New York Times, that it has set an impossibly high legal threshold for proving genocide. And it's true that investigators will need to collect evidence and lawyers will need to make their case. This is one of the reasons that gathering evidence right now is so critically important. And I'm glad that a number of efforts are underway to do so. But we shouldn't be afraid to call out a genocide because it may be difficult to prosecute. That really is for the lawyers to worry about later. And if the legal threshold is impossibly high and not appropriately high, then maybe it's time to rethink that threshold. And maybe it's time to rethink and broaden the meaning of the term and to bring it more in line with its original conception. Putin should ultimately be tried for genocide and for other crimes against humanity and war crimes, and also for launching a war of aggression. He should be tried either through existing institutions or through the creation of a Nuremberg-like tribunal, like the one that is currently being discussed. He's not the only one who should be tried. His ministers, advisors, military leaders, propagandists, they all should be tried as well. And again, it's this collection of evidence that's happening right now. This is absolutely critical. It's critical for future trials, and it will also be critical for the historical record. Something that is especially important here, given Putin's campaign of disinformation in Russia. But of course, we need to keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, Putin is not deterred by talk of legal reckoning, right? Putin's Russia is a bandit state. It is operating outside of the norms of international law. It has broken universal principles, principles that Soviet diplomats and lawyers had actually played an important role in establishing at Nuremberg. Putin frequently uses the language of international law, but in an effort to degrade it. In fact, the Russian prosecutor's office invoked the Genocide Convention last month in order to justify its closing down of Instagram. This too is part of Putin's plan, part of his efforts to destabilize the international order through what one of his advisors has called the constructive destruction of the existing model of foreign relations. There's also a second thing to keep in mind, which we all know, and that's that post-war justice is carried out by the victors, right? Ukraine has to win the war, or Putin has to be overthrown. Trials are going to be a thing of the future. For now, the focus must be on stopping genocide. And that's why I think it is so important that we use that term. Calling out Putin for genocide matters, and it matters right now, and not just for the sake of advocacy. We must understand the war's aims, and that the war's aims include genocide in order to understand the nature of the conflict. Policymakers and lawyers who argue that the war is about Russia's security concerns and put forward draft peace proposals that ask Ukraine to make concessions, they are playing into Putin's hands. How can Zelensky negotiate with Russian leaders if Putin's aim is to wipe Ukraine and the Ukrainian identity off the map? World leaders who use the term genocide are absolutely correct to do so because it clarifies things. It makes us understand what is at stake in this war for the Ukrainian people. Now, I agree that we're in uncharted territory here because the aggressor has nuclear weapons. And I don't know the answer, right, about how to proceed, like once we call it this and once we recognize that this is what's happening. But I do know that not calling it out and not recognizing that this is what the war is about has costs, and not just for the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hirsch. Our next speaker is Douglas S. Urban Erickson. Excuse me. Dr. Urban Erickson is assistant professor at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. He has worked in the field of genocide studies and mass atrocity prevention in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Cambodia, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Argentina. He is the author of books, chapters, and articles on genocide, religion and violence, international criminal law, and political theory. His first book is titled Raphael Lemkin and the Concept of Genocide. He is currently writing a second book, Dying in the Age of Thoughtlessness, Genocide, Terror, and Conflict Resolution. He is a senior fellow at the Alliance for Peace Building, a board member of the Institute for the Study of Genocide, and a member of the editorial board of Genocide Studies and Prevention, an international journal. Professor Urban Erickson will be talking about the historical context of genocide as well as about the UN definition. Professor Urban Erickson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marta, for that, for this putting together this this outstanding panel. Thank you, Oksana, for the first invitation that I received. I do want to say that you always. Sorry about that. I got muted and I couldn't unmute. It's really a joy to be a panelist on these panels. You know, it's a tall order to follow Professor Moses and Professor Hirsch because I've always learned a lot from them throughout their whole careers, and I continue to on panels such as this. I'm going to, since their talks covered a lot of what I had planned to speak about, I'm going to adapt slightly and maybe offer some reflections from my own position on what they had to offer. So I would say that, you know, as at the end of Professor Hirsch's comments, you know, she made the remark that the concept of genocide helps us understand the nature of the conflict. And I had just gotten done this morning writing a sentence loosely worded around that in a draft of an essay I'm writing. And it's a joy to see this, because I think there's wisdom in that, and I think that she offered a way of understanding. She offered a way of presenting this in a way that can actually help us deal with questions of what we would call conflict resolution, but also what's going to be the inevitable aftermath of this conflict. And as people have to put their lives together and rebuild and piece together a life, that will look like a life in all the ways we find life meaningful, right? In home and family and traditions and security and prosperity and so forth. So there's a really important conflict theorist to emerge, the former Australian Secretary of State, John Burton, who sort of launched the field of conflict resolution. And he had this very important sort of framing of conflict as basic human needs. And one of those basic human needs was a need for security and social groups and identity. And people would fight over that. And I think that security also becomes important when we're thinking about the aftermath of this conflict. So that notion of framing the conflict itself as genocidal becomes important for understanding how you negotiate as international actors, how you structure your advocacy as individual advocates, as human rights advocates. It becomes important as we as scholars write about it, but it especially becomes important with the kinds of movements that are undertaken in order to bring a conflict to the end in a meaningful way, but also rebuild. One of the joys I've had of working in a department which I never thought I would get hired in, didn't know where I was going to get hired, but I ended up being hired by a peace school. Is that I'm going to put a book here in the chat. This is Rutledge did I just sent that to one person. Tom, I sent that to you. Can I ask you to repost that for the participants?
For sure.
So this is a book by my colleague Susan Allen, who for decades has been a key facilitator of peace talks in Georgia and South Ossetia. She has some other very interesting ones that are still, I'm not allowed to tell the public where she's working. But this one was recently sort of unveiled, and she wrote a book about this experience. And it begins with a beautiful, beautiful ethnographically informed description of what it's like to walk into peace settlements. And she talks about the men in suits in the rooms who define peace and who say peace cannot be achieved. But then she talks about this elaborate process of trying to figure out how to sideline the men in the suits and to look for everyday peace builders. And that's where I really begin to think that, that we can begin to look towards these kinds of approaches for how we can structure our advocacy, our activism, our scholarship, but also importantly, our foreign policy. So I think I want to sort of double back now and begin to talk about what I think is important about the history of this concept of genocide. Part of the joys of being a graduate student was I've now lost all my hair. When I go back and I look at these pictures of my presentations as a grad student, I had hair. That marks the passage of time. But there was a point when I did think that my first project on Raphael Lemkin would be a lot of taking the inspiration of Professor Moses's work. That there's actually something in there that I wanted to demonstrate. And I think it's important to recognize that the major powers at the United Nations wanted nothing to do with this conception of genocide the way Lemkin presented it. Lemkin also defined the Nuremberg trials as cowardly and timid, right? Because they had, this part of this was jealousy at training. And that history of training is so important because Wyszynski denounced Lemkin as an enemy of the Soviet Revolution in 1933 in a book that Trainin wrote, right? It's in the preface. So there's a long history there. And long into the 1940s, Lemkin is writing letters to Wyszynski, right? Activating this. He remembers that, right? So part of this was jealousy that Trainin's conception of crimes against peace becomes so important. And Lemkin's crime of genocide, which he defined as a peacetime crime, gets largely ignored until later. And so at the UN, this conception of genocide as a peacetime crime becomes the reason why the Indian delegation picks up the cause of genocide and provides that crucial vote. And that's important because India at the time was still under colonial rule, British rule, right? And the Philippines is still a protectorate of the US at the time. The Philippine government at the UN becomes a huge advocate of this conception of genocide. And in 1947, Pakistan, joins the UN as independent state. And as India and Pakistan are accusing each other of genocide, they're both teaming up and arguing for a genocide convention because they think it can prevent the British from coming back. So what you get is this sort of what Professor Moses described as this colonial crime, right, that Lemkin's proposing is completely rejected, right, by colonial powers. And what you get then is a fierce political battle between Lemkin has the votes to force this into the floor of the UN. And you get a battle between what is this thing going to be called, and how is it going to be outlawed, and what's the final definition. And this is interesting in a way, because you lose things. For instance, Lemkin spends 45 pages in Access Rule documenting things such as forced impregnation, right, as an act of war. Well, that's a horrible euphemism for something we now call rape. The payments of 2 women who bear German blood, children of German blood. Well, this is wartime rape. And he was documenting forced marriages. He's documenting all these horrors, which become so important for these women's organizations at the UN for backing the Genocide Convention, right? And when Lemkin says this in his memoir, he says there would be no Genocide Convention if it wasn't for the women's NGOs. And that's how he meets the UN representative, Pandit, right? She's at that women's meetings, right? She backs the UN Genocide Convention there. And the final draft of the Genocide Convention doesn't have rape as a technique of genocide. It doesn't have forcible marriage. It does, but it has preventing births, right? And it has removal of children. So it's this erasure of things that people who cared about it and advocated it for, they don't get everything they want. And the women's NGOs and the women's networks don't get everything they want. They're not backed. And one of these things that becomes important is Stalin got a lot of what he wanted, right? And so Norman Naimark's really, really important book, which is really important in this, is to come back and say that even if Stalin thought he got a law that would prevent him from being punished, it still applies. But a crucial point of this is Anton Weiss-Wendt's really great work. He's got the treaties of the Genocide Convention drafts where Stalin and Wyszynski are underlining these things, and they're blue and they're red pencils, right? And very clearly, they know this Lemkin guy. They think they think that this is just a continuation of his 1930s crusade against the Soviets. And they're arguing that there are no nations and races in the Soviet Union because those are actually political and economic groups. And that's the part which became so interesting, because when you listen to Putin's rhetoric, the Ukrainian nation is a function of the machinations of the West, right? And the economic sort of machinations of the West. So literally the Ukrainian nation as a social group is a product of economics and history, right? And so Stalin thought that was all it was needed to prove that, that the mass famine of Kazakhstan and Ukraine wasn't genocide. And that strikes back into this other thing, which is that I think there is a reality here which can be extraordinarily difficult to prosecute genocide, precisely because the law was purposely written that way. I mean, Lemkin's definition of a nation, Lemkin's own words, he says a definition in nations include card players and union members, right? Literally anything that we could think of as on our term social group now, right? That's sort of that word that we can currently use. That's how Lemkin defined nations. So nations are these big things, right? Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Americans, but nations were also these things like card players, right? And he contemplates in his final writings, criminal law being an aspect of genocide. You could commit genocide against criminals, and that's what states do, right? Lemkin was writing. So that becomes interesting because Lemkin's first 2 books in the 1920s were about the Soviet Union. The third was about fascist Italy. This is Polish language works. And he's arguing in these first 2 books, they're translations of the Russian and Soviet penal codes, but he offers commentaries. And he's arguing those first 2 books that the Soviet Union and then then Russia within the Soviet Union, the second book, have criminalized enemy forms of consciousness, right? And have used the force of the state to eliminate enemy consciousness, and with the purpose of constructing a brand new sort of national identity, right? And he argues that that's embedded within the penal codes. Right. Well, that's the checkup. That's the secret police, right? That's the beginning of the penal structure. And what's fascinating is long into Lemkin's life, he believes in his public writings, in public, he's denouncing Black activists in the US for using the word genocide. But in his private writings at the same time, he's arguing that this is actually genocide, right? And there's a whole history there of why he sides with the position of white sort of perspectives. And that's because he's got this whole sort of, and I mean, this is like, he wants the US to ratify the Genocide Convention, and he doesn't want the US to not ratify it because they think it could support the cause of Black civil rights leaders, right? So he's publicly denouncing, right, Black civil rights leaders, but he's privately supporting them. And he's arguing that the system of imprisonment in the US becomes a function of genocide, which he sees as being the same as the Soviet technique. And there's an aspect here which becomes interesting in the sense that this is what very much what Professor Moses is talking about when he talks about permanent security, right? This is the idea that Lemkin had in mind, right? Lemkin's idea of outlawing genocide was a broad framework, right? Of targeted, could be states, didn't have to be states, could be religions, right? Oppressive actions that was really interfering in sort of the lived experience of individuals, right? And that idea gets rejected flat out, right? So how does that sort of come back? Well, I think this is where, you know, Professor Hirsch, I think is right in the sense that in some ways, it doesn't matter what international lawyers are going to say about this. The law is what the law is, what the law is. Are you ever going to prosecute Putin, right? Is he ever going to bring Putin before a tribunal? If you did, what good would it do, right? Well, you have to start contemplating the collapse of the government in Russia, right? To think about that. Better instead, I think, are the kinds of fact-finding missions that Professor Hirsch was talking about, the kinds of truth processes, the kinds of documentation that could be embedded in international tribunals, that tribunals could support, but also could be embedded within historical projects. And I think there's a good reason to begin to document this and to go ahead and use the concept of genocide, recognizing that the law is so written it's written in a way that is extraordinarily broad when it comes to the sort of the understandings of what constitutes genocide, but so incredibly narrow when it comes to the groups upon whom genocide must be committed legally. So it's purposely broad and purposefully narrow. I think that's a hurdle that I don't think is ever going to be reached. But my point is that I guess it doesn't matter, right? You let the courts be the courts. The point is that this conflict right now has a long history, and that history matters when we've come to think about how to respond to it. And without playing into a lot of the kinds of rhetoric that would actually make this conflict a lot harder to resolve. And I think that to me is an important message. It's an important one to sort of carry through. So I will say that, you know, I can sort of go on and on, right? There's this you know, like Professor Moses and Professor Hirsch, I see 14 minutes and 20 seconds. I got 40 seconds left of my 15 minutes. So I'll use this to finally conclude that, you know, the first countries Lemkin wanted to prosecute for genocide were Algeria and France, right? That's it. Those are the first two countries. The third one was the Soviet Union. And I think he understood at the end of his life that this was never a possibility. So we get this narrative that Lemkin was somehow sort of like celebrating the Genocide Convention, kept up a brave face in public, but his private writings are really, really, really clear-sighted. You know, I mean, he sees his work as a failure, right? He looks at his life work and he's crushed. He has this line in his memoir that the Genocide Convention is now in the hands of statesmen who live with perpetual sin with history, who treat life like currency in a bank. And he turns his efforts to working with local governments, national jurisdictions, to outlaw genocide under the national criminal justice structures of these countries. And he focuses his efforts there. And he focuses his efforts in activism because he understands that those three cases will never be prosecuted. And I think that's the final sort of message here, maybe, is that international criminal tribunals don't have to be the place where people seek justice, right? Justice can be embedded in a way that's meaningful, right, for Ukrainians. It doesn't have to take place in a big fancy court at The Hague, right? It can be a lot of different ways towards that. And I think that's the final, as I hit 59 seconds, I'm going to turn it back over to Marta.
Thank you, Professor Irvin Erickson. Our next speaker, and I should mention, we will take questions Once all of our speakers have spoken, we will invite them to comment on each other's presentations, and we'll be taking questions through the chat function. Erin Farrell Rosenberg will be our next speaker. She is a visiting scholar with the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights and an adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati School of Law. She works as a legal consultant advising victims and advocacy groups, including serving on a consultant basis as the senior legal and policy advisor for the Dr. Dennis Mukwege Foundation. She spent a decade working in international criminal law, beginning at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, before joining the International Criminal Court. She has served as a senior advisor for the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she was the lead author for a report series on how the Genocide Convention's obligation to prevent applies to Burma. She is a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of International Criminal Justice, the ABA Working Group on Crimes Against Humanity, and New Lines Institute's Rohingya Legal Forum. Ms. Farrell's remarks will focus on the obligation in the Genocide Convention, which we should remember is named the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And she'll be looking at the obligation to prevent genocide in the context of Ukraine. Thank you. You have the floor, Erin Farrell Rosenberg.
Thank you very much. I would say good morning, but I believe it is exactly noon. So good morning, good afternoon. I would like to first actually begin by thanking the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, the University of Alberta, for organizing and hosting this incredibly important conversation. It's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion with my distinguished co-panelists, and I will try not to take too much advantage of speaking last, though I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, as so many really important points have already been raised by the first three presentations. Let me begin by highlighting just two initial points. First, I do want to be clear that I am a lawyer. I am not a historian, and I am also not an expert in any way on Ukraine or Eastern Europe. And so I want to be clear about what my expertise is and what it is not. And in this sense, my remarks are going to focus on the issue of genocide with respect to Ukraine from a legal perspective, not a historic perspective. Second, as you just heard, my background is primarily, though not exclusively, in international criminal law, meaning individual criminal responsibility, which my co-panelists have also already made reference to as a body of law. However, my remarks will not address, in fact, at all, whether or not I think that genocide is occurring with respect to international criminal law. Why? Because, and I want to be fairly blunt and straightforward about this, I strongly believe that this is the wrong legal framework to engage with at this moment in time, and believe that the academic, legal, and political communities need to move away from the obsession with believing that the law is confined to international criminal law. I want to be clear, and I hope that my remarks will be understood in this way, that I strongly believe that the issue of genocide is incredibly relevant to what is happening in Ukraine. And it is one that I believe needs to be much more centered in the debates currently taking place, both at the state level and at the UN. But perhaps most importantly, I also believe that binding international legal obligations necessitating action have been triggered for states with respect to the question of genocide in Ukraine. Notably, as you will hopefully have understood at this point, not under international criminal law. As I've already said, I do not believe that the urgent legal issue we are facing is whether or not genocide is being committed by the Russian Federation. Indeed, I believe that this framing risks serving as a distraction and potentially leading states to incorrectly believe that only when there has been a determination of genocide are they obligated to act. This is not correct under the law. The question of a determination of the commission of genocide is also not an inquiry that I believe that states are properly suited to carry out. States are not judicial bodies and should not, in my view, attempt to mimic or replicate judicial proceedings. I don't want to spend too much time on this point, but there are important due process rights that cannot be severed from the applicable standards of proof, and which cannot be ensured outside of judicial proceedings, which renders much of this discussion in terms of international criminal law incredibly academic and theoretical, and having no real ability to actually impact on the current situation. So what should states and the international community be looking at if it is not whether or not Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine? Well, here we turn to the Genocide Convention itself and the International Court of Justice's 2007 Bosnia and Serbia judgment. We are therefore moving from the legal framework of individual criminal liability, leaving that aside, and moving to that of state responsibility. Article 1 of the Genocide Convention sets out two obligations in addition to the prohibition on commission of genocide. States are also obligated to prevent and punish genocide. As you heard in my introduction, I am going to focus on the obligation to prevent. The International Court of Justice's 2007 judgment is incredibly important with respect to providing much needed clarity about the prevention obligation. What does the court say in 2007? That the obligation to prevent genocide is independent of the obligation not to commit genocide, that it applies extraterritorially. That means that states have an obligation to prevent genocide, not only within their own borders, but in other, when there is a risk that it is occurring or could occur in other countries. It also establishes that it is in what's called an erga omnes, as well as an erga omnes partes obligation. What this means is that the obligation applies to all state parties to the Genocide Convention, and in fact applies to all states in the international community as a whole, even when a particular state has not ratified the Genocide Convention. Now, most importantly, what the 2007 judgment establishes is in relation to the substance of the obligation to prevent. And here I am going to read for you in full what the ICJ has said. A state's obligation to prevent and the corresponding duty to act arise at the instant that the state learns of, or should normally have learned of, the existence of a serious risk that genocide may be committed. From that moment onwards, if the state has available to it means likely to have a deterrent effect on those suspected of preparing genocide or reasonably suspected of harboring specific intent, meaning genocidal intent, it is under a duty to make use of these means as the circumstances present. So from this, we can see four distinct sub-issues that I'm just going to very briefly touch on in my remarks. First is the knowledge element, a state being aware, or that they should have been aware, of the existence of risk of genocide occurring. This suggests that states and the United Nations should have in place a standardized process to assess the risk of genocide. And here I would just note that in much of the debate, but also within state infrastructures themselves, the vast majority of states do not carry out genocide risk assessments at all. So you cannot know that which you are not looking for. It is very important actually to have a clear risk assessment that is carried out on a standardized basis in terms of any situation where there may be a genocidal risk. So this notion of conducting a risk assessment leads to the second issue. What are risks of genocide? What does that mean? What is a state actually looking for? Well, here we have two different frameworks which have been propagated by the UN Office for the Prevention of Genocide. They've published two separate frameworks. One is about atrocity crime risk factors, which includes war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and includes risk factors and risk indicators specific to the crime of genocide. And the second, also put forward by the Office for the Prevention of Genocide, was done by the Jacob Blaustein Institute, and it establishes an entire series of genocide risk factors that it pulls from human rights law and international human rights abuses. So under both of these frameworks, when we apply them to Ukraine, and here I would refer to what Professor Hirsch was saying, we find that under both of these frameworks, a number of the genocidal risk factors are present. Separation of children, denial of group identity, hate speech directed at a protected group. We have a widespread commission of human rights abuses, as well as international crimes, such as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, one of the point about risk factors is that the presence of risk factors are not in themselves causal. This means from a legal perspective that the fact that a risk factor is present does not necessarily mean that genocide will occur or that there is a causal relationship that has been established. So we have the presence of risk factors in Ukraine. Now we turn to the question of, is it a serious risk? Because recall what the ICJ said, this obligation is triggered when there is a serious risk of genocide. And in these last 5 minutes of my remarks, this is actually what I really want to focus on. And I really want to, in some ways, maybe push back or reframe what has been said to date in terms of what the law is and what is necessary in terms of genocidal intent, specifically in terms of the obligation to prevent. Again, recalling that this is an obligation that, once triggered, applies to third-party states, meaning it is the obligation of the United States of America as a signatory. It is the obligation of all European countries as signatories to the Genocide Convention that, once triggered, they must take actions to deter and mitigate the risk of genocide in Ukraine. So in terms of how we determine whether or not the obligation has been triggered in the sense that we have a serious risk of genocide, I want to just explain to you what the ICJ actually found in the Srebrenica genocide. And I also want to just clarify, because this has been said repeatedly, including by Philippe Sands, and it's not correct, that the standard of proof, which has been adopted by the ICJ, which does come from international criminal law, is not so impossible that genocide would never be recognized, because we have had genocide convictions, including in terms of Srebrenica, including in terms of Rwanda, at the ICTY, right, using this standard. So it is not correct to say that we could never determine that genocide occurred. The law directly contradicts that statement using the standard of proof that the ICJ has adopted. But that's just to leave to the side. What was actually found in terms of Srebrenica? Let me give you some dates. The end of June, the Republika Srpska and its military arm, the VRS, made the decision to invade and occupy Srebrenica. And these are findings made by the International Court of Justice and by the ICTY. Beginning of July 5th, we have the beginning of military operations to take over Srebrenica. Up until the 11th, these military operations continue without genocidal intent. The ICTY and the ICJ have both found that the military objective became genocidal with respect to Srebrenica either on July 12th or 13th. And from that point onward, the military campaign became a campaign of genocide. And then, of course, we have July 13th is the beginning of the Srebrenica genocide. Now, with that in mind, remembering the decision to invade was taken in the end of June, and genocidal intent actually formulates on July 12th, after the military operation to occupy Srebrenica has already begun. What did the court say in terms of Serbia as a third-party state its obligation to prevent the Republika Srpska from committing genocide. They made two things that I just want to highlight in the last minutes of my remarks. They say Serbia could hardly have been unaware of the serious risk once the VRS forces had decided to occupy the Srebrenica enclave, and they found that President Milosevic was fully aware of the climate of deep-seated hatred which reigned between the Bosnian Serbs and the Muslims in the Srebrenica region. Why is this important? A serious risk from the moment VRS forces decided to occupy the Srebrenica enclave, the end of June, because of an awareness of deep-seated hatred. The obligation to prevent was triggered on Serbia, and Serbia was found liable, right, responsible for not preventing genocide prior to the formation of genocidal intent. And what this tells us is that suspicion of that a person may be harboring genocidal intent in terms, a perpetrator may be harboring genocidal intent in terms of when the obligation to prevent is triggered. It is not required that we establish the presence of genocidal intent. What is required, I would suggest, is whether there are circumstances that indicate an environment where genocidal intent can easily develop, the vulnerability of the protected group should genocidal intent develop, and finally, whether or not the perpetrator is factually in a position to act swiftly should genocidal intent develop. And I see I'm just going over, so I'm going to just stop. Oops, sorry. I'm going to just stop here by saying, if we apply this to Ukraine, and this is my final comment, and what is happening in Ukraine, the urgency of the international community to mitigate the risk of genocide is incredibly high. Why? Because Russia is occupying, they have perpetrator control of swaths of Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are in an incredibly vulnerable position because there is a complete blockage of humanitarian corridors. I just want to conclude with really asking everyone here listening, academics, whether you are a lawyer or not, is to really do not forget that there is a binding legal obligation to prevent genocide. And it is my view that it has been triggered. And when we speak of what should happen now, and what states should be doing, and what the United Nations should be doing, it should be about taking all possible means to prevent genocide from occurring, not debating whether or not it is happening or discussing what will happen at some future point in a criminal tribunal. The urgency, moral, political, and legal, is to act now, and the obligation to do so, in my view, has been triggered under the Genocide Convention, Article 1, obligation to prevent. So with that, I will close my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Farrell Rosenberg. I'd like now to ask our panelists, who among you has a burning question for another member of the panel following on these really fascinating presentations? Don't be shy, or I'll call on someone. Okay, let's at least, we don't have so much time left. Let's at least have one question to each of you. Dirk Moses, would you like to start with posing a question or making a comment about one of the other presentations?
Sure, I'd like to ask Erin a question for clarification about her very powerful presentation. So just to fill us in, what is a qualitative difference between a military intention and a genocidal intention? And you say that, you know, there's from one day to the other, the ICTY adjudicated that the occupation of Srebrenica transitioned from one to the other. What is that in the law?
So it's a fact-specific analysis, which can't really be replicated as a generalized statement. What, in terms of Srebrenica, what you see in terms of the way that the military objective was reframed was on July 12th, you have essentially the crystallization of a policy which moves from one of military control of Srebrenica and the suppression, right, of the Bosnian Muslims to extermination. Now, I very much, and I want to be very clear about this, I love Professor Moses's writings and thoughts, and I think that it's so incredibly important. I think that what you raise about state security and this idea of the sort of purity of genocidal intent not ever being realistic is exactly correct. In fact, if you read most of the criminal law judgments, you'll find, in fact, that there is an acknowledgement throughout that there are other intents and motivations, that this is not sort of a pure, as such, uniquely on the basis of whether it's race, religion. But in that situation, it becomes sort of this transitional moment. And I guess I would say in terms of the Holocaust, we see something somewhat similar, right? Where we move from the 1930s, where we have a number of restrictive laws, we have the detention camps, we have the forced labor camps. And as you have, right, in the 1941, the final solution being really sort of like formalized and crystallized as a plan, the way in which that morphs back, right, into the populations that were already in labor camps, that were already in detention camps, is sort of that moment where the genocidal intent shifts. It doesn't mean that what was occurring previously didn't have discriminatory intent and potentially even indications of genocidal intent, but just that was the moment I would say that it crystallized as a truly uniquely genocidal intent.
I will ask Dr. Hirsch to either comment what's been said, or maybe she wants to pose a question. Dr. Hirsch?
Yeah, no, this is such an interesting panel, and I just want to, there's so much to think about now, and I'm really grateful for just this reframing of things away from the need for like thinking about tribunals per se versus these other elements of peacekeeping and also like what states can and should be doing in the moment. So I have a bunch of questions, but I guess I'll ask my question then to Douglas, which is then in terms of thinking about the kinds of peacekeeping and historical questions of reconciliation and historical narrative, right? Are there concrete, you mentioned some examples, like what do you think we should start to be doing right at this moment, imagining sort of a future in which we can get there?
This is a great question, because I was actually going to ask you something similar. So maybe I can try to answer and then throw this back at you. I think there's a part of the logic of this, when people who write about genocide, they're looking constantly at the fact that these are not just crazy people in power who execute these plans, right? However we define genocide, right? I mean, this is I mean, like in the UN process, New Zealand is that they're writing letters. The delegates in New Zealand are writing letters amongst themselves. Uh-oh, if we go along with the Genocide Convention, what are we going to do about our cannibal problem? Right? I mean, the South Africans are like, what are we going to do about Black people if we outlaw genocide? Right? They're having these debates and letters they're writing to each other. Now, if they're by themselves, that's just crazy talk, right? But they have there's a lot of people in these societies who actually agree with that, right? So to execute these plans, you have to have broad social sort of engagement, which in the context of Russia means that there's a lot of people in Putin's political base who actually believe this, or else Putin would be, I mean, he tossed out of power very quickly. So how do you then engage that? That's the dilemma, because if you start attacking Russian interests, right, the more NATO rockets end up hitting military sites and accidentally killing civilians 30 miles, 40 miles, 50 miles into Russian territory, the more that's going to confirm to average everyday Russians that, uh-oh, Putin actually was right. So how do you engage in that effort to prevent something without driving people back to the strong leader? And leaders know that, and they manipulate that. There's all this important work across genocide studies. Ben Valentino's work, for instance, Draining the Sea, right? I mean, I can just go on and on and on. The way groups elicit attacks upon their own people to drive those people closer into a political relationship with the strong leader. So in a very interesting way, many, many times the efforts to prevent genocide actually backfire. And you know, this is a lot of the work that you know, Cooperman has been showing over the years, is that armed groups actually solicit attacks upon civilians in order to drive those civilians closer to them as lines of defense. So how do you engage in this, right? How do you engage in genocide prevention without ordinary Russians being further driven into Putin's political power? I mean, these sanctions have hurt poor and middle-class Russians and driven them closer to Putin politically, right? The serious polls that I'm reading, the people who I know who follow Russian politics, like, you're not talking about 80, 90% support for Putin, right? The more those sanctions impoverish poor people. So that's my question back to you. but for me, I think the success cases for places that you've really seen de-escalations and mass violence, the potential for it has been in places where you can actually stop the discourse around this sort of trading of accusations of group hate, right? And this is for the book that I'm writing now has huge case studies on Burundi, which, because the president has died, actually allows me to write more openly about this. One conversation I had with Dirk Moses is, I hesitate to sort of talk too openly about this, but a particular history professor in a particular university of the country controls artillery in the hills of DR Congo, right? And is rewriting books and so forth to sort of reframe the history in certain ways. And you step back and you think about how do you talk about genocide prevention when the discourse of the past and group hate becomes so politicized? Well, the only way out of that is to, what I saw, all the work I did in Burundi for all these years was convincing the American government to stop talking about genocide prevention. Like, the more you talk about that, the more these people become scared that the US is going to intervene on behalf of one party. And the more another political party uses that to arm themselves, right? So now you got US guns flowing in from Rwanda, and you got Russian guns flowing in, right, to the government in Burundi. You're looking at the second poorest country on earth is going to be the site of a proxy battle with American and Russian made munitions, right? Well, the more you talk about genocide prevention, the more they're going to go and collect those guns from Russia, right? So you had this remarkable sort of de-escalation of violence when they stopped talking about genocide. Stop talking about it, right? Because all of a sudden the stakes of ethnic conflict became less consequential, right? So I think there's a set of evidence around the world where if you de-escalate that rhetoric, right, and you sort of tone it down, you get the political opening for people to begin to negotiate. And I think that's, Professor Frenzy, that's the dilemma right now, right? So how do people who are experts on Russian history and Russian society, or real experts, how can you help us understand what a foreign policy should look like that doesn't just drive people right into the hands of Putin's propaganda, right? That to me feels like the wicked problem of all this. So, okay, I get off my soapbox. I'm gonna push mute, right? I tell my students I'm gonna mute myself like a crab on the beach and crawl back into my hole. As I push mute and sort of let you answer my question back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I worry that we're too late at the moment in terms of any kind of de-escalation of rhetoric, right? So then it's a question of what else can be done. I wrote a piece recently about just what's happening within the Soviet Union in terms of, like, I really think that it's like making this slide into totalitarianism, where right now where there's no free press, right? It's very, very difficult to get accurate information into the country. And those opinion polls, they're meaningless because there's so much oppression and so many human rights violations within Russia itself, right? So I think that that there needs to be some kind of a counter propaganda campaign for sure against the way that Russia is talking about the war. There needs to be a way of getting accurate information. I mean, that's part of the problem too, that many Russians are not getting accurate information about what's even happening. And even those who are getting information, they don't want to believe it. So there's a refusal to even, they're not seeing the same news that we're seeing even, right? And they're in fact being told that, that they're preventing genocide. Right. This is, again, the way that the war is being presented and has been for some time, actually going back for years now. The Russian people have been told that the Ukrainians are Nazis who have been carrying out a genocide of Russians. And so this cynical manipulation of this language has been going on for such a long time. Disinformation is so rampant that I mean, I agree, that's the fight that needs to be fought. I think by, there's so many Russian NGOs that were pro-democracy NGOs that fled, so many Russian activists and dissidents that are abroad now. That some way of bringing them into an effort to try to get accurate. I think right now it's about accurate information, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to throw it back to Erin then. I mean, once you have accurate information, so that's one thing, right? Getting the Russian people and the Russian military, because that's the thing too. If the Russian military thinks that it's going in to prevent a genocide and it's all riled up to do that, so that's a serious problem. So I guess practically, how do we move then into this prevention?
So I think that's a great question. And I think what Doug was talking about is also really important, is that, and this is why I really want to highlight the 2007, what the court actually said, because I do view it as incredibly important that we start thinking about prevention as something which should occur when we are at the persecutory, right? Persecutory, as opposed to necessarily genocidal stage, because I think it brings the stakes down. Mm-hmm. Every time we, even from a prevention standpoint, if we say, prevention requires establishing genocidal intent at a lower level, right, than necessarily beyond reasonable doubt, we are raising the sort of stakes in terms of the frame, which is why for me it's actually important to recognize that if we can understand prevention as steps which should be taken to essentially prevent the formation of genocidal intent, where we see a conducive environment involving, as Professor Moses laid out, essentially indicators of the crime of persecution, lower discriminatory intent from genocidal. But I also think that, in terms of how you get information about prevention from a practical perspective is simply a reframing of international humanitarian law, right? Of why is it important? Why should the Secretary General talk to Putin about opening humanitarian corridors? It's not simply because it is an IHL requirement, but also because it is a way for Russia itself to meet its own obligation, right? Under the Genocide Convention. And I think presenting it of that way of, okay, Russia, you say you're not committing genocide. These are the things that you need to do, however, in this conflict, so that we can all be essentially assured that there is no trigger moment that pushes an escalation. And I think that way of sort of engaging with Russia, as opposed to you are committing genocide, but rather that this is an obligation, and we're going to talk about it in terms of not just your humanitarian law obligations, but the obligation that this situation not devolve. And that puts it in a future tense, which I think, to go back to what Doug was saying, can kind of de-escalate the way we're talking about this. And maybe Russia, in that sense, whose history is so important to the Genocide Convention itself, would feel more political pressure, feel more reasoning of why it should agree to, for example, humanitarian corridors, that it can also point to.
I have a question. Can that be meaningful if at the same time the state media continues with, some of you I think are following the same feeds that I'm watching. For example, if anyone out there is interested in English translations of what's on Russian state TV, you can follow Julia Davis, and you see this constant escalating rhetoric, demonizing the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian people. Can it be meaningful, and if that's going on at the same time? That's a question. Maybe
I would say the same thing though here, and I would like to also hear, you know, what the other panelists say about this, but the same thing is just simply that in denouncing those types of statements, that we should not shy away from just simply saying that this kind of language can increase the risk of genocide. I really believe that it's just simply that in talking to Russia, that this should be something that, as you say, like this is happening on Russian media. So why is it that in terms of the commentary around this, there is not a talking point used by the United Nations, used by the Office for the Prevention of Genocide, used by other states of saying, Russia, this is irresponsible because this is risking creating an environment where genocide may even be tolerated. It's creating an environment for the tolerance of abuses. You need to stop this. I guess that would be my point, is to use it as a tool.
Well, it seems so obvious that why isn't it happening then? Why isn't the UN doing that?
That I don't know.
It seems like an easy thing to do.
Yes.
Relatively. Yeah.
It's why I believe that prevention should be centered in this debate, that we should be talking about this, using this as a tool to pressure Russia to change its behavior, and also to hopefully encourage states to take more actions to prevent or to protect the Ukrainian people.
I wish I was as optimistic. I mean, that's you know, there's some hope in that, at least. There's some hope in that.
I think it's been really fascinating today, this discussion of, you know, the focus is so often, obviously, and for good reason, on the crime of genocide, but that there are so many reasons to be focusing on prevention. First of all, that it's there in the convention as an obligation. Also, that it's a way that you can actually have a discussion about something, preventing something rather than blaming about what's already happened, so that it reframes the conversation in a way that at least allows for some other action or some other conversation than has already been taking place. We probably have 5 more minutes. Do any of our panelists have something they really would like to say to follow up on this discussion so far? I have a comment. There are a couple questions in the chat. I'll ask one. Professor Olga Andreevsky asks, and this is, we've just been discussing this very question. So if it seems that genocide cannot be stopped as it is happening, if perpetrators cannot ultimately be brought to justice, does it render the concept useless? Any comment?
Perpetrators can be brought to justice. It's important.
I guess she's talking specifically in the Ukrainian case with Putin in power.
Right. And there again, we should not make sort of necessarily like absolutist statements about this. I think that the reality is that any justice will only take place, and this is across the board in terms of any proceedings, well after the fact. And so it's just really a question of what is your priority. If it's accountability for that person, then don't discount that that may occur. If it is stopping and preventing and halting through arrests or something like that, that will not happen. Judicial accountability should never be understood as a policy tool for like intervening and stopping something. It's an after the fact accountability measure.
Right. And I would say that I think that the term, I repeat a little bit of what I said earlier, I think it's incredibly important, again, in terms of understanding what's happening, because if you talk about soldiers committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, I think that's very different from talking about a state that is inciting genocide, right? By talking about a state that is inciting genocide, a state that is carrying out genocide, by talking about the need to prevent genocide, we're talking about a larger issue. So,
why is genocide a larger issue than crimes against humanity, which requires widespread systematic approach? Same scale. I mean, you're putting this in a hierarchy, it seems, Francie, or am I misunderstanding you?
Again, for me, it's a question of when you're talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity, you can be talking about the crimes of a state or the crimes of individual soldiers, right? You can be talking about the crimes of individual officers. When you're talking about genocide, you're talking about a state policy. At least that's how I understand it. And that then necessitates, it's not a question of like worse. I mean, genocide was listed as a war crime at Nuremberg, and it was listed as a crime against humanity afterwards. So I think we need to continue to talk about war crimes and crimes against humanity. And ultimately, if it becomes easier to prosecute genocide as a war crime or as a crime against humanity, if we're going to talk about prosecutions later, I don't think it matters what it's prosecuted as long as it's prosecuted, right? But I think that when we're talking about intent, when we're talking about incitement, I do think that it matters, because it gets at the overall intention of what a war is about.
Maybe if I can just add, Professor Moses, because I think this is actually pretty important, and I'm going to make a plea at the end of this remark. So crimes against humanity, this is actually something that's not necessarily understood. We have the Genocide Convention, we have the Geneva Conventions. So we have state responsibility for the crime of genocide, we have it for war crimes. There is no convention establishing state responsibility for crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are within the Rome Statute for individual criminal liability. Right now, at the United Nations, in the Sixth Committee, the Legal Committee, there is a draft Crimes Against Humanity Convention, which would establish a state responsibility to prevent crimes against humanity. For anyone who is activist-minded, I would really ask that you lend your support to having the Crimes Against Humanity Convention brought into force. It closes one of the most important gaps that remains from Nuremberg in terms of state responsibility. But it is important in terms of prevention. I don't know that people realize this. There's a huge gap. There is no state responsibility at the international level that's codified.
I can, if I could also sort of ask this, there was one of the things that really stuck with me, my sort of over the last decade, is when Ocampo was giving a talk at our campus, and I was sort of watching in the background, and there's a lot of genocide activists who were, present in my school at the time, and they were really nailing him, right? For why are you not arresting Bashir? Why are you not arresting Bashir? And he said, because they shoot back, right? And I think that just, crystallized the way in which international justice is a function of politics and power, right? And that is a really, really, really bitter pill to swallow for people who are suffering grave human rights abuses, who are suffering these things, because these international criminal laws were created by people who really, truly did feel that states committed horrible, horrible, horrible crimes against individuals in the name of security and peace, right? And I think, and so you constantly get caught between the ideals of the individuals who brought these laws into being, and you get caught with the people who are suffering these same things, with the reality that these institutions, we've placed moral responsibility to execute these laws in institutions themselves that do commit these acts. And that is the, I'm going to throw a link here. I put this is an essay I wrote. The reason I do this is because I have a hyperlink to a really good debate between Tim Murithi and Lori Nathan Laurie Nathan teaches at Notre Dame Croc. He's a negotiator of armed conflict, and Tim Murithi is one of the biggest theorists of transitional justice. They had a really, really great debate over what does it mean to compromise and make peace with a genocidal dictator. And that means at some point when you're talking about peace, you're talking about ceding to the power of the person who's executing that genocide and including them in the peace settlement, which inherently recognizes their power. And that is the dilemma of all this. So justice then becomes feeling like it's impossible, right? If you're suffering at the other end of this. And that's part of the thing, that there's no professor, there's no scholar, there's no person who studies this is going to have any good answer for that. And I think the answer to that is it's got to be embedded in other places. And that's part of the dilemma, right? It's part of the bitter pill that people have to sort of swallow, right? And Tim Murithi's point is that justice becomes something that happens afterwards, right? When people try to make sense of what happened to them and rebuild and sort of come together to try to figure out how they're going to live together in peace. That concept of justice in the middle of these atrocities is never going to be found, right? And anyway, I thought it was a great debate. So you can hit on the hyperlink where I wrote Laurie Nathan and Tim Murithi and find their essays.
I'd just jump in and say that it's my hope, at least, that the ability of the international community to go in and document atrocities right now, whether you call them genocidal or not, will have the effect of creating a base of knowledge that, for one, may even have preventative effect even now, as the scale of what is happening is publicized, and some of it gets through to the Russian public. It has an effect on the world leaders that are interacting with Putin, how important it is that there's the support, the finances, the resources to go in and document what's happening now, regardless of the distinctions between genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity. Well, with that, unless any of our panelists have a burning last comment they'd like to make, okay, then it's left for me to thank our participants for participating in a really important discussion that I think has expanded our understanding of issues around genocide as they relate to events in Ukraine today. I'd like to thank Tom Merklinger for ensuring the technical aspects went smoothly for today's event. Dr. Oksana Vinik, this roundtable was her initiative. She made sure that we followed through, that we reached out to our stellar panel. So thank you, Oksana. To the Temirtay Foundation for its ongoing support of HREC, and also to the Bazuki family for its support that has allowed us to expand HREC initiatives. A reminder that today's event was organized by the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. And with that, I bring this event to a close. Thank you all for attending, and do watch. We may be able to post this online at a later date. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.